My parents sent me the bill for my wedding after offering to pay for it and giving $400,000 to my sister, but they're shocked when I hand them the check and this letter. I never had the best relationship with my parents, but it wasn't terrible either. They always showed a preference for my sister, Sarah, but I learned to live with it. Sarah, now 32, is what you'd call the golden child, and at 28, I was used to living in her shadow. Growing up, I watched her get the newest phones, better clothes, and more attention, while I made do with hand-me-downs and worked since I was 16 to afford the things I wanted. I didn't complain much. I understood that my parents weren't obligated to give me more than the basics. Besides, I took pride in being independent. The real surprise came when Sarah got married 3 years ago, and my parents gave her and her husband the incredible sum of $400,000 as a wedding gift, which they used to buy a beautiful house in a luxurious neighborhood. At the time, I was genuinely happy for her, although it did sting a bit. I had my own life. I was doing well as a software engineer, had saved a good amount of money, and was dating Tom, who would later become my husband. I thought my time would come and didn't dwell on the fact that my parents had never given me anything even remotely close to what they gave Sarah. After all, I didn't expect it. A year later, Tom proposed. We'd been together for years, and he was everything I'd dreamed of in a partner. We planned a modest wedding, nothing too extravagant, because we wanted to save for the future. Neither of us wanted to spend all our savings on a single day, no matter how important it was. We had budgeted around $36,000, which seemed reasonable for the kind of wedding we wanted. Elegant, but not excessive. To my surprise, my parents offered to pay for the entire wedding. I was touched. I felt that, for once, they were acknowledging me as equally important. They seemed enthusiastic, asking about venues and vendors, and genuinely appeared interested in helping. I didn't think much about the amount. I assumed that since they had done so much for Sarah, perhaps they wanted to do something for me as well. I never expected them to contribute anything even close to what they gave Sarah, but their offer to cover the wedding seemed generous. The wedding day was perfect. We had a small, intimate ceremony with close family and friends, exactly as we wanted. My parents gave speeches, danced with us, and seemed genuinely happy. For the first time in a long while, I felt they were finally treating me as an equal, as if they were proud of me. Tom and I planned to go on our honeymoon the following week, but we had some work commitments to fulfill first. So, 2 days after the wedding, I received an email from my father. It wasn't a heartfelt note or leftover gift card as I had imagined. Instead, it was a detailed invoice attached as a PDF, listing every expense they had paid for the wedding. The email was brief and cold. Please settle this at your earliest convenience. Your mother and I expect prompt payment. I stared at the screen, unable to believe it. The invoice totaled $34,546.89, meticulously accounting for every floral arrangement and appetizer. Tom found me sitting there, frozen, and when I showed him the email, he was furious. It wasn't about the money. We could pay it if necessary, but that wasn't the point. My parents had offered to pay for the wedding. I hadn't asked them to cover a single expense. They came to me, offered it as a gift, and even seemed excited to be part of the planning process. They had been boasting at the wedding, portraying themselves as the generous parents who paid for their daughter's big day. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about the money. It was the culmination of years of being treated as less important than Sarah. When she got married, they gave her $400,000 as a gift with no strings attached. They didn't ask her to pay back a single cent. Now they were billing me for my wedding, treating it like a loan, which it wasn't, because they never mentioned that. The next morning, after a sleepless night talking it over with Tom, I made a decision. I sent my parents a check for the full amount, but also included a letter. I didn't want to confront them directly because I knew I wouldn't be able to contain my emotions, and I didn't want it to turn into a shouting match. In the letter, I explained how hurt I felt. I reminded them that I had been independent since I was 16, paying for my own things while watching them give everything to Sarah. I wrote that when they offered to pay for the wedding, I naively believed they were finally treating me with the same love and care they always showed my sister. Instead, they had betrayed me. I didn't hold back. I told them that all this time I had let many things slide and had never said a word about how differently they treated Sarah and me. But what I couldn't accept was this cruel deception. They made me believe they were giving me a gift, only to turn around and demand payment as if I were a stranger, not their daughter. I also wrote that this would be the last financial interaction we'd have. From that moment on, I would reject any offers of help, support, or gifts from them. I made it clear that I didn't want anything from them in the future, not even an inheritance. I told them they could give everything to Sarah, as they had done with everything else. I mailed the check and the letter and blocked their numbers. Tom supported my decision, and I felt a sort of relief after sending everything. They were completely silent for days. Then messages from distant relatives started coming in. Aunts, uncles, and family friends began calling and texting, accusing me of being ungrateful and dramatic. They said my parents had done so much for me and that I was overreacting. Sarah also called, yelling that I was tearing the family apart. She said I should have paid the bill without making a fuss. Typical Sarah, always taking their side, and why wouldn't she? I haven't responded to any of them. I don't know what to say. On one hand, I feel my actions are justified. After years of being treated as second best, this felt like the last straw, and I wanted to stand up for myself. But on the other hand, I keep wondering if I'm overreacting. Am I being too sensitive? Was it unreasonable of me to expect them to treat my wedding as a gift, just as they did with Sarah's? Should I have just accepted paying the bill and moved on? Tom's family has been incredibly supportive through all this. His parents were horrified when they found out what my parents did and have been checking on us every day. But the constant messages from my side of the family are starting to wear me down. I'm really stuck now and not sure if I'm the one in the wrong. Part of me feels I had every right to be upset and stand up for myself, but another part wonders if I've created an irreparable rift in my family. Maybe I should have handled things differently. Update 1. Since my last post, things have gotten worse. I had no idea that the simple act of sending that check and letter would trigger such a reaction, but here we are. Yesterday morning, I woke up to an email from my mother. It came through because she used her work email, which I hadn't blocked. The email was long and pretentious. In it, she explained that the invoice they sent me wasn't meant to be taken seriously. According to her, they never intended to cash the check. It was all, in her words, a life lesson about financial responsibility. They wanted to test my reaction, and once they felt I had learned the lesson, they planned to tear up the check and surprise me with a real wedding gift of $100,000. I couldn't believe what I was reading. A life lesson? What kind of parents deceive their adult daughter like that? After reading that, it became even clearer that this wasn't about love or fairness, but about control. They wanted to see if I would oppose them or blindly comply. It felt manipulative and cruel. In response to my mother's email, I sent a brief reply. I kept it simple and direct. Thank you for confirming that this was indeed a deliberate test and not a misunderstanding. After sending it, I blocked her work email as well. I knew they'd try to contact me again, but I wasn't interested in more games or lessons. Later that night, things escalated further. Sarah showed up at my apartment unannounced. She started banging loudly on the door, shouting my name. At first, I didn't respond, hoping she'd give up and leave, but that didn't happen. Instead, she began yelling through the door, saying I was being childish and blowing this issue out of proportion. She said our parents were only trying to teach me responsibility because they were worried about my spending habits. That comment, coming from Sarah of all people, made my blood boil. This was the same woman who had never even paid her own phone bill, never worked a single day without our parents' support, yet she had the nerve to lecture me about financial responsibility. As she kept talking, I quietly started recording everything on my phone. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I wanted to have evidence in case things got even more complicated. Sarah went on and on about how I was tearing the family apart over something so trivial and that I should just apologize to our parents and move on. She said they never intended to hurt me and had always done their best for both of us. She insisted I was overreacting and that this whole situation was my fault. I didn't respond. I didn't open the door. I just sat there, listening in furious silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she left, but not before calling me selfish and accusing me of trying to cut ties with the family over money. That night, I received more messages from distant relatives. Apparently, Sarah went straight to our parents after her failed attempt to talk to me, and now they were mobilizing everyone. My phone filled up with messages from aunts, uncles, even some family friends. Most of the messages followed the same pattern, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of causing unnecessary drama, and urging me to apologize to my parents for how I had treated them. One message in particular shocked me. It was from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years. She told me I was lucky to have parents who cared enough to teach me these lessons, and that I should be grateful they were willing to spend so much on my wedding. She ended her message by saying I was fortunate to have parents who wanted to be involved in my life. I couldn't believe how quickly everyone had turned against me. It was as if they all decided my parents were right simply because they were the ones with the money and power. No one cared about the emotional manipulation or the years of favoritism that led to this situation. They only saw that I was rejecting my parents' supposed generosity, and that was enough to side with them. At this point, Tom was starting to worry about how much this was affecting me. He kept asking if I wanted to take a break from social media and turn off my phone for a while to give myself some peace. He tried to reassure me that I wasn't wrong and reminded me of all the times my parents had shown favoritism toward Sarah and how they had always used money as a tool to manipulate both of us. The most frustrating part was that I couldn't get any real answers. My parents weren't trying to reach out to explain themselves further. They truly believed in their own narrative, seeing themselves as misunderstood parents who were just trying to help, while I was the ungrateful daughter who had blown everything out of proportion. For now, I'm trying to focus on the life Tom and I are building together. We can't do much else right now, just hope that things will get better eventually, I suppose. Update 2. I wanted to start by thanking you all for your responses. While I've been trying to stay strong, things have continued to unfold. A few days after Sarah's visit, I received a call from my father's brother, my uncle. I hadn't spoken to him in years and honestly didn't know what to expect. He was never very close to the family, so I thought he was calling to tell me to fix things with my parents like everyone else. Instead, what he told me left me speechless and put everything into perspective in a way I hadn't seen before. He started by saying he'd heard about what was happening through the family and felt the need to reach out because apparently, this wasn't the first time my parents had done something like this. 20 years ago, something similar happened between him and my grandparents, my father's parents. My uncle refused to go along with my grandparents' manipulative tactics, and as a result, they smeared his name throughout the family, accusing him of trying to steal from them and being ungrateful for everything they'd done for him. He explained that back then, my father didn't support him. In fact, he took his parents' side, which led to a major rift between the two brothers that never fully healed. My uncle said he always felt abandoned by my father, and that it took him years to come to terms with how our family really operated. Listening to him talk about the past was like hearing my own story, but in a different context. My grandparents used money and manipulation to control my uncle, just as my parents are trying to do with me now. The more he talked, the more everything made sense. My parents weren't acting out of character. They were repeating a pattern established long before I was born. They learned this behavior from their own parents, and my father, having been complicit in his brother's situation so many years ago, was now playing the same role with me. My uncle also mentioned that his refusal to comply with my grandparents' demands had severe consequences. After the falling out, they cut him off completely, both financially and emotionally. They painted him as the black sheep of the family, and to this day, there are relatives who still believe the lies my grandparents told about him. It was all about control, he said, and when they couldn't control me anymore, they erased me from their lives. Just like that. Hearing my uncle's story gave me chills. It was like a reflection of what was happening to me now. My parents were upset because I refused to play their game, and instead of trying to understand my perspective, they had turned the whole family against me. I began to see how deep this toxic cycle ran and how ingrained my parents were in the belief that they could control their children through manipulation. After my conversation with my uncle, I couldn't stop thinking about everything he had told me. It made me wonder if, deep down, my father's behavior was driven by guilt. Maybe he knew he had abandoned his brother all those years ago and was now trying to justify his actions by using the same tactics. My parents had built their relationship with Sarah and me around the idea that we owed them something, and any deviation from that script was seen as a betrayal. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about me. It was about them, their own unresolved issues, and unhealthy dynamics they had learned from their own parents. In the days that followed, I continued to receive more messages from relatives. It became clear that Sarah had been working overtime to turn people against me. One of my cousins, with whom I'd always had a good relationship, sent me a long message telling me I was being selfish and disrespectful for not appreciating everything my parents had done for me. She said it wasn't too late to fix things, but that I needed to humble myself and apologize before it was too late. Her message was filled with the same rhetoric everyone else had been using, and it was exhausting to read. I realized I had grown up in a family where love was conditional. Everything came with strings attached, whether it was financial help, emotional support, or even something as simple as celebrating a life event like a wedding. And now that I had refused to follow their rules, they were isolating me, just as they had done with my uncle. Tom has been my rock through all of this. After the call with my uncle, we sat down and had a long conversation about the future. He told me that no matter what happens, we'll face it together, and that I don't owe anything to anyone, not to my parents, not to Sarah, and certainly not to the relatives who had suddenly become armchair psychologists. His support has been invaluable, and I'm grateful beyond words. Then something strange happened. I received a voicemail from my dad from another number, probably a relative's. It was the first time he had tried to contact me directly since I sent the letter and the check. His voice sounded different. He didn't sound angry or demanding as I had expected. Instead, he sounded tired. In the message, he said he didn't want to fight anymore and was willing to talk if I was open to it. He didn't apologize or acknowledge what had happened, but it was clear that something had changed. Maybe he was starting to realize that this time I wasn't going to give in. I haven't responded yet. Part of me wants to call him back and see if there's a possibility of having an honest conversation about everything. But another part of me knows this could just be another attempt to manipulate me into feeling guilty. My uncle's words echo in my head. They will never admit they're wrong because they don't believe they are. If I decide to talk to my dad, I need to be prepared for the possibility that nothing will change. I want to believe that my parents can change, that they can finally see me as an equal and not just someone they can control. But I also know that after years of being treated this way, it's going to take more than a single conversation to repair the damage. As much as I want a clear answer, I'm still in the same boat as always, and maybe that's okay. I'll keep you all updated as things progress, but for now, I'm trying to navigate this as best I can. Update 3. I want to start by saying how grateful I am for all your responses. Your advice and support have been invaluable as I try to handle this mess with my family. When I first posted, I didn't know where all this was going or what I wanted to do. But after reading your comments and doing a lot of reflecting, I've come to some important realizations. One thing that really stood out from your responses was that many of you pointed out that I had been forcing myself to try to fix things with my mom and dad, attempting to patch up the relationship and pretend everything was fine. But the truth is, I finally accepted that it's okay if things don't go back to normal, because honestly, I'm not even sure what normal was. The dynamic with my parents has always been unhealthy, and I've spent years trying to ignore it. Now I realize that it's okay to let go of the idea that things will someday be the way I wish they were. Many of you also noted that perhaps I had been too lenient in assuming my father's behavior was driven by guilt. Looking back, I see that I was clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, his behavior was motivated by guilt and that he might change. You were right. Guilt doesn't justify his actions or excuse the years of manipulation, favoritism, and emotional control. No matter how guilty he might feel, that doesn't erase the harm that's been done, nor does it mean I should forgive him outright. At the same time, I realized that I need closure. I need to end this chapter of my life, whether or not there's reconciliation with my parents. So I decided to meet with my dad. I felt it was something I needed to do to get that closure for myself, not for them. When I met with my dad, I could tell immediately that he wasn't the same person I grew up with. He seemed exhausted, almost defeated, and for the first time in my life, he actually seemed remorseful. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," in those exact words, but he apologized for how things had turned out with the wedding and for how both my mom and Sarah had treated me. He even mentioned that he had spoken to some of our relatives and asked them to stop bothering me, which was a small relief. But then he did something that caught me off guard. He tried to give me the money back. He pulled out the same check I had sent him for the wedding expenses and slid it toward me, asking me to accept it back. He said that he and my mom had discussed it and wanted to make things right. This time, I was prepared. I told him as clearly as I could that I wasn't going to accept the money back. I made it clear that this wasn't just about money. It was about everything that had happened over the years, how they had always treated me as second best, and the emotional impact that had had on me. I explained that accepting the money back wouldn't fix that, and that this was no longer a financial transaction, just like their supposed $100,000 check that only materialized once everything had come to light. I could see his frustration when I refused to accept the money. It was as if he didn't know what else to offer me. I think, in his mind, giving back the money was his way of saying, "I'm sorry," but that didn't address the deeper issues that had been poisoning our relationship for years. He couldn't see that the damage wasn't something that could be undone with a check. After I told him I wouldn't accept the money, he was silent for a few minutes before saying he didn't want to lose me. He said he knew things had gotten out of hand and that he didn't want our family to be destroyed. I could see he was trying to be sincere, but even in that moment, I realized I wasn't seeking reconciliation in the way he wanted. I wasn't interested in going back to how things were or pretending that everything could suddenly be okay. What I needed was space, a real break from the toxic dynamic that had defined our relationship for so long. So I told him that I needed a break from the family and that, while this meeting had been important, it didn't change much. I explained that I wasn't ready to just forgive and forget and that I needed time to heal in my own way. He didn't argue with me, which surprised me. He just nodded and said he understood. He didn't try to convince me to come back or tell me I was overreacting, as he had in the past. In a way, that was more of an apology than anything else he could have said. Maybe it doesn't fix our problems, but at least it feels like a kind of closure for me. If nothing new happens with my story, then this will be my last update. Update 4. Many of you have asked why I haven't responded to my relatives who took my parents' side, and while I may not have mentioned it before, I did. It's just that those interactions weren't particularly noteworthy. To every family member who tried to convince me that I was being dramatic or ungrateful because my parents had done so much for me, I responded with a simple question. Like what? Interestingly, most of them fell silent or tried to change the subject, reverting to their usual arguments where I was the villain for questioning my parents. So honestly, there wasn't much to report from those interactions. They were more of the same. But as I said I would update if something truly new happened, here I am. My parents have cashed the check, and while that might seem like it should bother me, it really doesn't. In fact, I'd prefer that any financial ties with them are completely settled. If they feel I truly owed them the money for the wedding, then let them take it, and with that, I hope to close that chapter definitively. However, it doesn't end there because with my family, things never really do, especially in their favoritism. I found out recently that my sister has been having trouble getting pregnant and has started fertility treatments. This in itself wouldn't be unusual, but considering the history and timing, it all seems part of a pattern. I don't have concrete proof that my parents have decided to cover Sarah's treatment costs, but the fact that they cashed my check right at this moment seems at least suspicious. Doing some research, I saw that these treatments can cost anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000, sometimes more depending on the process and location. Considering that Sarah has always been financially dependent on our parents, it would make perfect sense for them to decide to cover the treatment costs. Don't get me wrong, when I gave the check to my parents, it was with the intention of settling accounts. I don't mind them using that money for whatever they wish. But considering that just a few weeks ago, my father seemed remorseful and had expressed a desire to return the money, this feels like another game on their part. My mother had only said that the wedding bill was a lesson, and now it seems that lesson has a convenient destination. What hurts me most isn't the money itself, but the fact that the same dynamic is repeating. This situation keeps reminding me of all the times I was sidelined in favor of Sarah. So after talking with Tom and processing all this, I made the decision to do something I never thought I would: tell my story openly. My uncle, who had already shared with me his own story of manipulation and control by the family, is fully on board. We've decided to publish a letter on my social media, detailing everything that has happened, from my perspective and also from his. My part of the letter will cover the entire story, the details of how I was treated since childhood, the emotional and financial manipulation, and everything that has led me to take this stance. My uncle will include his own experience, sharing how he too was subjected to this kind of treatment and how he suffered the consequences of not giving in to family pressure. I didn't make this decision lightly. I know that by making this story public, I'm probably going to receive a barrage of reactions, and not all will be favorable. But I'm tired of it all. So if the rest of the family still wants to side with my parents, good for them. I'm not going to have further contact with them after they've read what we have to say. I'll block them and continue with my life. There will probably be one more update after this when I share the reactions and consequences this has brought. Update 5. Here's what I hope will be my final update on all this. 2 weeks ago, we published the letter with my story and my uncle's, and the responses haven't been slow in coming, bringing with them some discoveries and, in a way, a sense of relief. To start, I confirmed that my parents did indeed pay for my sister's fertility treatment. Not a surprise, of course, but receiving confirmation so publicly, thanks to some comments made in response to the post, gave me the certainty I needed to see the reality without any doubt. It's sad to realize that the favoritism is so deep and evident to everyone, but it helps reaffirm that I'm not crazy, that I haven't imagined any of what I've lived through. The reaction from the relatives was, unfortunately, predictable. Most sided with my parents, justifying their actions in countless ways, repeating the same old excuses. Even in the face of evidence of manipulation and favoritism, the toxicity seems to run strong in this family's veins. To them, my parents can't be that bad, and somehow there's an explanation that absolves them. Some even had the audacity to say they did it for my own good, to teach me to be stronger. However, I also received some different messages. There were some apologies, and a few relatives sent me more neutral comments without taking sides, perhaps understanding a bit better where my pain comes from. Even if they were lukewarm messages, they were still exceptions, and the vast majority remain loyal to my parents and sister. My parents also responded, although in very different ways from each other. My father tried to address some points of the story, partially admitting some mistakes, but still with excuses that minimized the real damage. For her part, my mother and sister continued with the same old discourse, arguing that everything had been a necessary lesson. I asked them a simple question: what was the lesson behind giving $400,000 to my sister, which was much more than the supposed $100,000 I would have gotten if I learned the lesson? Because as far as I and many who have read my story see it, the one who needed that lesson about effort and responsibility was my sister, not me. I'm still waiting for an answer, but I doubt it will come. My family hasn't changed and won't change, but I've taken a weight off my shoulders, and now the truth is out in the open for anyone who wants to accept it or ignore it. Update 6. It's been 2 years since I last shared an update, and this time I finally bring happier and more positive news. Over these years, I've learned to live with the distance I've established with my family and to build a life of my own. While many of you in the comments recommended that I distance myself from my family due to their toxicity, several also mentioned that if toxicity was a tradition in my family, it would be best if my sister didn't continue to spread it. And apparently, that's how it's been, in an unexpected way. The big news is that while my sister continues to face difficulties, I have become pregnant and am already 6 months along. It's been wonderful news for my husband, his family, my friends, and of course, my uncle, who has supported me unconditionally at all times. It's been incredible to see the joy and love this news has brought into my life, especially after years of feeling undervalued in my family of origin. But as you can imagine, this news hasn't been well received by my parents or my sister, which unfortunately is no surprise. My sister, who has been trying to get pregnant for some time, is not happy at all. She has spoken poorly of me and my future child, which shouldn't surprise anyone reading this now. My parents aren't happy either because they've been paying for all the treatments under the sun. I still have no contact with them and much of the family, and that's how it will stay. I don't want them trying to be part of my life or my babies now. I'm the one who wants to impart a lesson, a clear and simple one. If you treat people with favoritism, don't expect the others to let you into their lives when something good happens. I know my story isn't the most typical or cheerful, but I wanted to share this ray of hope. Despite years of manipulation, jealousy, and distance, I now know I can build a life of my own, a family based on true love and genuine support. My story, complicated and bitter as it has been at times, has shown me that even when everything seems to go wrong and family feels like an endless burden, life can still surprise us with good things. So this is the good news, and I hope that among all the difficult stories and sad updates you find online, this little joy brings some light. Not everything is lost, and yes, despite everything, good things can happen.